So recently, perhaps as a response to any one of several, I believe there are four now, of our further notes on the importance of context in representational, rhetorical, descriptive, demonstrative, illustrative, and or performative acts of communication, uh, perhaps in response to that series or a series that precedes that series. The poet Charles Bernstein and his friend Tanya Foster responded to some of the ideas that we've been putting into discourse in a reading of a particular poem of Bernstein's. And bless you. And I doubt that that response had much to do with the way that I had performed a reading of a poem by the guitarist for the band Hawkwind in the manner and style of Charles Bernstein, which I did, but I like I said, I doubt that the reading had much to do with that particular poetic performance, but rather had to do with this discourse that I'm elaborating upon, involving not so much the content of content, but the structure of content. And in this discussion of the structure of content, I'm performing the structure of content in relation to the values and trajectories that it might have, much in the manner of the way that that Jakobson takes on the question of the message and in the act of communication, and expands all of the elements that are involved in it. But because Jakobson was a very intelligent, and much of his work was published later, he was largely a pre Second World War thinker and thinker, a member of that group referred to as Russian formalists. A lot of the thought, that went into his discussions of these elements, remained sort of embedded in that particular zeitgeist. And of course, in the early part of the 21st century, we have the benefit now of looking at all of this technology which has emerged following the Second World War, and of including our understanding of that in our discussion of codes of communication and means and methods of messaging, and of all of the kind of elaborate systems and contexts that go into acts of communication that weren't as obvious in Jakobson's time, and that of course includes messengers like Aaron, who for some would remain outside of the bounds of this definition of intentional communicative acting machines, right? And for some, perhaps not. And so whether Aaron is an actor on the stage of communication is something that would not have occurred to Jakobson simply because of his time. So the issue that we're dealing with right now in this extended discussion of context is partly, the contexts in which context can be contextualized, but beyond that, all of these other aspects. So, for example, I put this piece that we're listening to, the sound from, in the background. I put that up yesterday, and it's a series of images, and they're accompanied by sound, and those images exist in space and time, and in multiple spaces and time, and refer to multiple spaces and time. And I gave it a title, and it's situated at the top of the page in relationship to the last piece on context. And then I'm gonna change that image, today, and I'm gonna substitute something else, and then I'm gonna change the title of the last piece on context. Now, the relationship to the piece that we're looking to and the piece on context have this relationship because of a number of things, a number of formal issues that they share. The slowing down of time, the elaboration of an event in multiple time frames, the perception of that event, the ability to perceive sound elements in different time signatures, and how some of those perceptions become diminished in other time signatures, and because of a reference in the title, this piece is referred to as the evolving early abstractions of the Wayang Purwa. And the last contextual piece, you'll see, if I don't want to change the numbers, but I really have no choice. So in order to discuss this piece, well, I won't. You'll just have to take my word for it. So, you know how the communication systems here work, and in space-time travel communication systems, the systems are coordinated around values, and those values correspond to a number of things, but one of the things those values respond to, those mathematical values, are views. And so if I click on this and this changes to 2, I have effectively made an active communication. So I don't want to rush into that too quickly, but without clicking on this and making a further active communication, let's just say, and you'll have to believe me, although it's going to change sometime today, so if you want to find out, you're going to have to click on this and change that value, right? But I'm going to say that one of the subtitles is Cecil. This is an image of Cecil, the lion who was murdered by that hunter. I can't remember what state he was from, but I do remember that he was a citizen of the United States, right? And, if you look up Cecil, not spelling Cecil very well here. If you look up Cecil the Lion, you can read that story, and you don't have to take my word for it. But Cecil the Lion was murdered by, I believe he was a dentist. So Cecil, he lived primarily in, I'm not sure I know how to pronounce this word, but Huangi, maybe, National Park. And here's another difficult word to pronounce. Let's see. Matabeleland North, and that's in Zimbabwe. So Cecil was a native of Zimbabwe. Whether Cecil was a citizen of Zimbabwe or not depends on your understanding of citizenship, right? And lions don't take tests to, ensure their citizenship, but he was a native, and he was protected as a native, lion. He was, not all wildlife in Zimbabwe have protective status, but certain lions do, and he fell under this protective status, and he was killed by this by this dentist from, let's see if we can find out. Okay, this dentist was named Walter J. Palmer. He was an American citizen, and then because he was an American citizen, and I believe he was born in the United States, he had American citizenship and presumably a citizenship of some state. So let's see what other kind of citizenship he had. I really can't remember. Maybe we need to click on, let's see if we can find out where Walter J. Palmer's dentist office is. Yeah, I know he's a dentist. I know that. I want to figure out what state that he lives in. And because it'll become relevant in the conversation as it proceeds. Wow, it's a lot of information on this page, but it's very hard to navigate. You can see how it keeps Minnesota, it looks like. Walter Palmer, 60, from Minnesota. Okay, so this Walter Palmer, who murdered Cecil the Lion of Zimbabwe, who didn't quite have Zimbabwean citizenship, but was a native of Zimbabwe and was protected by certain Zimbabwean, rights, whether, one wants to refer to those as, because they certainly aren't human rights, but, whether those are civil rights, or not. This Walter Palmer was also a resident, right, and citizen, we could say, belonged to the citizenry of Minnesota and the United States. All right, and the reason that becomes important, and what I was saying was that the subtitle of, if you would click on this piece, you could confirm that in the same way we had just confirmed my story about Cecil. You could confirm that this is, in the subtitle, referred to as Cecil as, and then Baranket word, as, and then another, which word signifies, Lord of the Jungle, right? Which word signifies. But in this context, it doesn't mean it really in the way that you might infer, but rather like spirit lord of residing, like spiritual guardian of the jungle. All right, so this as in the title that I've contextualized this piece helps us understand why it has a relationship to this piece. In addition to all of those structural features that I noted before, the slowing down of time, the perception of certain kinds of acoustic environmental sounds that are imperceptible at other time signatures, etc., etc., etc. And today we'll change this image, in part because we're talking about context and we want to reinforce that with the relationship of these images, but also in part because we're responding to outside discussion and connections made in our work, and we're communicative, right? We're always responding to communications back and forth with our interlocutors. All right, so Tanya Foster and Charles Bernstein responded to something, and I'm assuming that it's one of these context pieces, and not the imitation that I did of Charles Bernstein's style of reading his own work, which they may have been partly responding to that, and which Charles broke out of by adding a second reader in a certain sense, but still largely the performance style remained the same insofar as his part of the reading. Right? Okay, so the way that they responded to this piece was multiple and various, but one of the key features was the asking of this question. And the question they asked was, why not test for poetic citizenship? And the way that question was asked was slightly subtle, but involved, an anagrammatical rearrangement of the letters, largely the letters in Tanya Foster's name. And but it was, an unmistakable question, right, in relationship to the reading of this piece. So that, and we'll get to a project that Aaron agreed, to do with me for next week, but that involves a lot of work, and this is a Sunday, and I don't really want to begin all of that today. It's one of Lori's few days off, and so we'll do something other than working on that project. But Erin and I will do a series, and we'll ask this question. Well, we won't ask the question. We'll actually just create a series of poetic citizenship tests, and the reason that we'll do that is I had been thinking about this question: why not test for poetic citizenship as parallel to the question, why and how are we tested for U.S. citizenship? And the obvious answer is, well, the Naturalization Service in the United States has these citizenship tests, and they ask you questions about the United States, and these questions determine whether you can become naturalized as a citizen or not. And if you don't, of course, there are all kinds of economic and social entailments. Like, say you're fleeing a terror an authoritarian government that will kill you if you return. Like one of my former teachers, Dennis Brutus. So if you're not naturalized or allowed to stay in the United States, then that's effectively a death sentence. And Dennis fought the not only in the United States but in Great Britain as well, under the various prime ministers in England, the threat of deportation back to South Africa, where he would have either been killed or imprisoned, and so there are extreme social consequences for one's failure to respond properly and correctly to these questions and these tests. And there are, of course, economic consequences as well, like I've faced in my inability to get all of the proper credentials to become a teacher, which would have sustained my existence economically, but because of certain limitations that I have in testing that we've discussed considerably on this site, this has been a difficulty for me, and I've managed to survive, and that's terrific, but not really with much help from the kinds of testing services that are provided by naturalization systems and other kinds of sorting mechanisms that we have, and we generally fail to acknowledge or investigate very significantly here in the United States. All right, so I want to do that series with Aaron, perhaps beginning next week, and develop a series for poetic citizenship test. But today I want to talk a little bit about U.S. citizenship and immigration services form, and questions on the naturalization test. And perhaps my desire to do that was inspired by context and inspired by Tanya Foster's work, but particularly this essay on Claude McKay, right? On Claude McKay's beautiful poem, if we must die. And I believe I read this poem, and I believe that if I haven't read this poem, it was one of the poems I was thinking about when I read several poems, or like interpolated from my memory of these poems, kind of co-elaborated upon. And they included poems by Langston Hughes and I believe Claude McKay and Dennis Brutus, as well. And they were responding to the wave of murders of African American men and women in the United States. And I asked this question: when does an insurrection become inevitable? And I did it by kind of re-verbalizing through several of these poems, and I believe the Claude McKay poem was one of those. I'd have to go back and read it again. It's been a while now, and but I certainly have a memory of like thinking through that poem in that way, and so here's actually a selection from that essay, and the word citizenship is actually used in this paragraph. It's not entirely like the focal point of the essay, which you should read if you haven't read it, but it's touched upon, and it's touched upon in this moment where context is touched upon, and maybe that synchrony of citizenship and context is what was inspired, at least what inspired Tanya Foster's part of her response to this discourse. And I'll read it just briefly. So, Red Summer marked a particular period in U.S. life history and in the national zeitgeist. A mere 54 years after the end of the U.S.'s bloody Civil War, the summer made clear how claims to the rights of citizenship and honor by Black citizens were, and to some extent still are, met with racist anti-Black violence. Okay, and we see that all the time, and it's so even African Americans in their citizenship, who had been granted the right to vote, were tested, right? Again, like, do you really have the right to vote if you're tested at the polls? Especially when white voters were not tested, right? So this whole relationship between testing the citizens and who gets tested and who doesn't, and who gets to decide how and the parameters for that testing, and what those what those interventions in the rights of citizens, whether they're naturalized citizens or whether they're native citizens, are involving the series of rights that we have around and identified with being a citizen. So all of that was very interesting to me, and those connections were very interesting because I've been doing a lot of work on voting rights, and I haven't specifically been focused on the relationship between voting rights and what the rights of citizenship are, but they certainly pertain to that circumference of political arguments, and so given that context and that context for embedding within context, I thought I would look at this particular document, which is a series of
questions. Here's the first section, involves American government. What is the supreme law of the land? Because see, I wouldn't know the answer to this question. I would say, police violence. So I would say, what is the supreme law of the land? Police violence. I would get that wrong. What does the Constitution do? I would probably say the Constitution pretends to, offer rights to individuals, but fails to define, how those individuals either fall or do not fall within the confines of its protections. And then that would be wrong because, the answer is, sets up the government, defines the government, protects basic rights of Americans. And I would systematically get most of these answers, wrong. So proving that, I don't, even though I was born here, I don't really have the right to be a citizen. So just like I would fail the poetic, citizenship test, I would fail the American government section here, and I would fail to become I would fail in the act of being tested as an American citizen. All right, and so I thought, well, I don't have to take this test. Isn't that great? But then I thought, well, things are changing in the United States, and now we get tested for everything. So in the future, just like, there was a time when at the polls, African American voters would be called out and tested, on how many, beans were in a jar or whatnot, to see if they had the right to vote. Whereas, white citizens, weren't. There may be a time, when this is, reinstituted, and there could be, other examples of testing. So for those of us who are, native citizens, not Native Americans in the sense that, the Native American community, was here long before, Europeans, territorialized and stole the land from them. But natives in the sense of those individuals who were born here, now have these rights, right, that belong to the Bill of Rights. So maybe I would have gotten this one right. What do we call the first? Yeah, see, this one I would have gotten right because it's unproblematic, because it's what we call, not what is, right? So we don't have to ontologize or define it. We're just identifying the name. Now, once they start asking questions about what it does, I'm going to start to fail the test. But if you just say, what is the name? All right, I was going to say something, but it's a long aside, so I will leave it out until next time. But what do we call the first 10 amendments of the Constitution? Well, the Bill of Rights. Yeah, that I got. All right, so, but whether they, really are, they apply equilaterally across the board is another question, right? And, on that question, I would have failed. So I was thinking about all of this and, how right now, I have the right, to vote and remain in the United States. But, in the future, because of the rise of fascism here and all of the laws of exclusion and all of these, testings, there may be, tests that, you if someone accuses you, like I accuse, I shall accuse, I accuse, and then you would have to take this test and see if you have the right to stay here, or whether you're, exported out, like they wanted to, certain individuals, particularly on the right, wanted to remove, Dennis from this country, just like individuals in England, wanted to remove him as well. And what if they came up with tests for these kinds of accusations, and if you failed this test, then it didn't really matter whether you were born here or a naturalized citizen. You could be deported, either back to the community that wanted to murder you, or elsewhere, just to the border, maybe to drive you to Canada, to the border of Canada, leave you on the other side, or say you wanted, maybe this could be used, for women who chose not to. Chose to continue to believe in their human rights of autonomy over their own bodies, or maybe maybe they could come up with tests for individuals who believed in the autonomy to choose their identification with the sex and sexuality and gender of their self-understanding, and maybe they could come up with tests determining whether individuals with certain kinds of disabilities really belonged here or had the right to vote, or whatnot. And I thought, these tests could have like all kinds of valuable applications, sort of after the fact, right? Like, so when Trump, lost the election, but continued to look for votes elsewhere, and asked the members of these voting committees, to do away with some of these votes in these counties where he had lost, the presidential election by these narrow margins, or what he perceived of as narrow margins, like was largely in the thousands of votes, but I guess that was perceived of. So you want to get rid of these thousands of votes. Well, what if you had a U.S. citizenship test, right, that you could utilize like after the fact? So you just collect the names of these individuals who voted for Joe Biden, right? Okay, and then and you say, well, we're just checking to make sure these are legitimate votes, and so you select the ones that you want, and then you ask them these questions like, what is the supreme law of the land? And if they say, gun violence, then you throw it out, because it's like objectively true, right, that the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. Okay, so you say, what does the Constitution do? And you say, it pretends to la 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 la, and then you throw that vote out because it says here, no, it doesn't do that. It does these three things. And then they ask you this question: the idea of self-government is in the first three words of the Constitution. What are these words? Well, most people would get that, so you don't have to have this question on this version of the test, right? What is an amendment? One of the ways that you could utilize this question is you could pronounce the word amendment wrong, and then it would make it more difficult and challenging to get this one right. What do we call? We could leave this one out because it's too easy. What is one right or freedom from the First Amendment? And you could frame these in terms of like negatives and double negatives and stuff. It's like, what isn't one non-right or non-freedom from something that doesn't belong to the First Amendment? And then it would be more difficult to answer the question. So I was thinking, about that, and about testing's role in sorting, individuals in the school to prison pipeline, and how that school to prison pipeline is a sorting mechanism that focuses on largely sorting white citizens from citizens of color, and abled citizens, completely abled citizens, from citizens who's for whatever physical or other reason whose embodiment, doesn't represent this standard, right, of physical or intellectual or psychological or whatever it is. Normativity. Some of these questions, could be left just as is. Who does a U.S. senator represent? Oh, this is a really good one for Chuck 1600, right? Well, Chuck 1600 Schumer, because as we've been discussing, the rhetoric that he utilizes pretends that he's really referring to all of the people of. That's interesting. Who does a U.S. senator represent? All of the people of the state, right? But when you look more closely at the interests, it doesn't really represent all of the people of the state. And the very fact that, 1600 is the nickname, points to how and why, some of those people are left out. Anyway, it's all very interesting. And the story behind, this question is also interesting. So the question, why not test for poetic, citizenship? And it may grow out of a number of different issues, but in fact, Charles Bernstein, who partly asked that question, along with Tanya Foster, but who asked that question actually did test me for poetic citizenship back in must have been 1993, and I failed my poetic citizenship test. And I'm not sure whether I failed that poetic test either because I was unable to sign someone's name backwards because of my dysgraphia. That's my assumption. I was unable to sign professor's signature backwards as I was requested in the test, and for that reason failed the test. Or Charles just may not have liked me because I think it was either in 1986 or 1989. I had written this piece in I assume that he knows Michael Palmer, I think he's a slightly older poet, but sometimes is sorted into that category of language poets. And I was taking a poetry course from Michael Palmer, and one of the pieces that I produced in that course was this kind of Georges Bataille, esque, rambly narrative with a lot of symbolist references that kind of went back to like this, it was like very like decadent piece, and more French than British decadent, but that hark back to these like symbolist figures and images, and I guess I did it because I always thought of Michael Palmer as the best French symbolist poet among the entirety of language poets. And so I did this sort of prose poetic work, that I thought that he would enjoy, given his predilections and references in those particular areas. And in this particular piece, the sort of central event, because it was, semi-narrative, the central event was the death, or one could say the killing of this, King Charles Spaniel, and I'm not sure, but I have often feared that perhaps Charles Bernstein thought that somehow thought that this King Charles Spaniel was a symbolic representation of him, via the name Charles, which of course it wasn't. It wasn't even important that it was a King Charles Spaniel. It was chosen. The reason that this particular animal was a King Charles Spaniel was just because it wanted to relate, this grotesque murder, to something domesticated, highly domesticated rather than wild, right? And then highly refined. And I saw in the King Charles Spaniel, both an example of, something used, by an aristocratic, element of human society, and sort of over domesticated and highly saturated with all of these semantic references to nobility and king and all of this, but in any case, whether it was because Charles misread this piece that I had produced under this writing class in either, like I said, was either 1986 or 1989 for Michael Palmer, or whether it was simply like the material fact that I was unable to sign David Anton's name backwards on his letter of recommendation is still a mystery. But when we know that some subterfuge or misrepresentation was involved, because when I called Charles and asked him why I had failed the poetic citizenship test, he said, well, you had really good letters of recommendation. So maybe that was the answer, but it was ironic. Maybe the answer was precisely because I couldn't perform this act of signing David Anton's name backwards. And again, listeners, to the YouTube channel and readers of my work over the last few years will recognize that we spent considerable amount of time, practicing this, sort of after the fact, just like this U.S. citizenship test. So say you were, going to take this test because you voted in 2020, and they looked you up and they said, well, you voted for Joe Biden, and you, we think that, maybe you need to take this citizenship test for, to assure the fact that, you really are allowed to vote in our election. And so sort of after the fact, then you take this test and you fail it because, just like me, you identified the law of the land as police violence, gun violence, and or just police violence, you one or the other, and then they threw out your vote, and maybe they deported you. They wouldn't deport you to South Africa, not today, but maybe Brazil, or I'm not sure where actually, or maybe Russia, probably Russia, and so they deported you somewhere, and then like after the fact, it feels like it's too late, but you could study, you could practice, you could practice answering these questions? Or what if one of the questions was, you know, what are the first 3 words of the Constitution backwards, right? So you would practice writing backwards ELPOEPEHTEW. And, you know, once you really got it right, you know, you could maybe, you know, appeal your, in this case, not poetic, you know, denial of citizenship, but your, you know, appeal your loss of U.S. citizenship. So I was thinking about all of that in relationship to context and this response, and then, as I said, you know, Aaron and I, or you know, or either Aaron or I, or Aaron and or I, you know, next week we'll attempt to at least, you know, come up with, and we'll probably do a series. We'll probably do several different kinds of tests, and some of them may involve sorting, and some of them may involve identifying, and some of them may involve, you know, manipulation of you know, words and images, but we'll come up with a series of tests or segments of tests that you know, define this problem of poetic citizenship and are designed to, you know, determine whether one is a poetic citizen or not.